A very warm welcome to St. Peter's, the home of the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. My name is Anthony Billington. I'm the head of Theology here at LICC. Of course, it's a real delight as well to welcome Ruth Bancewicz, who's kindly taken time out to be with us this evening. Thanks a lot, Ruth. I've been really looking forward to this evening. I'm sure it's going to be fascinating. Ruth was recommended to us by a mutual friend who heard Ruth speak about issues of science and faith at Soul Survivor, and then I checked out Ruth's blog and saw that she'd been working on issues to do with beauty and aesthetics in science, and I thought that'd be a great topic to have an event on. So it's great that you're here. Thank you. If you know anything about LICC, you'll know of our desire to equip Christians to be disciples of Jesus wherever they are in their everyday arenas, on their everyday front lines. Disciples who listen to the word and listen to the world. As you may know, LICC was founded by John Stott, who for many years was rector of All Souls Langham Place, not far from this building. And among other things, John Stott left us that legacy of double listening to the word and listening to the world. And that really is the larger rationale for a topic like the one before us this evening, which we hope will help us think more clearly from a Christian perspective about our experience of what we call beauty, and what that beauty is and how we experience that in the world around us, including the world of science. And that's intriguing because I suspect for many people, we don't tend to associate issues of beauty or aesthetics or wonder with the world of science. But Ruth's going to show us tonight how wrong that supposition is. But I hope as well we'll go away from this evening feeling just a little bit more equipped to engage with friends, to dialogue with friends and colleagues on these issues of science and faith and beauty and wonder and awe as well. So with all that in mind, it's a great pleasure to have Ruth with us this evening. Ruth's been a research associate at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge since it was established in 2006. The Faraday Institute is an interdisciplinary research enterprise based at St Edmund's College in Cambridge, which not only does academic research, but also engages in public understanding in science and religion. And I'd be very happy if Ruth wanted to take some time to talk with us a little bit more about the work of the Institute. After studying genetics at Aberdeen University, Ruth completed a PhD at Edinburgh University on gene-environment interactions during vertebrate development. I don't know what any of that means, except that Ruth is a lot cleverer than me. In different ways and contexts, Ruth has been involved in working on the positive interaction between science and faith, including the Test of Faith Resources project. There's a table of books and DVDs over there that you're welcome to take a look at the break or at the end. And Ruth is also in demand as a speaker on Christianity and science at festivals like Soul Survivor and Greenbelt. So I'm delighted that she's with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Ruth.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. And it's nice that we're an intimate group so we can have some good discussion. Marie Curie wasn't a Christian. Well, I have no idea. I haven't read the whole of her biography, but I'm not sure what her faith commitment was, but she was certainly a scientist who enjoyed beauty in her work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight within a Christian context. But first I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself, just so you know where I'm coming from with this field. As was said, I did my PhD on these little creatures. This is the head of a 4 or 5 day old zebrafish. I'm not going to tell you about my PhD, mainly because I can't remember anymore. It was a long time ago. But I studied the eyes. This is the eye. You can see its lens protruding. This is a nice projector, and its cornea over the top of it. And they're very beautiful, and I never got tired of looking at them. I got tired of lots of other things during my PhD, but I always enjoyed my fish. I left the lab mainly because I think I wasn't patient enough to be a scientist. and started working for Christians in Science. And I feel very at home in LICC because we had all our committee meetings here in that room in there. I had my interview in that room in there when I started working for Christians in Science. We used to have all our conferences in here, so I do feel quite at home tonight. I then moved to start working for the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. Those leaflets are on your table. The Christians in Science leaflets are over there. Especially if there are young people in your life or anyone who's scientific, do give them a leaflet, or maybe if you are yourself. It's very cheap to join, and it's a brilliant source of support, mentoring, meeting other people, getting to think about science and faith. Now, the Faraday Institute was set up for a wider group of people. It's based in one of the colleges of Cambridge University. It's officially a secular institute. It does have a Christian ethos. We have a very unique position within Cambridge. We're based in St Edmund's College, which is a postgraduate and international student college. And we run short courses for anyone, graduates in any subject, mainly aimed at scientists, but we do tell our speakers not to use long words so that it is appropriate for people who aren't scientists. And we have a lot of material online. I was just saying to someone before, it's all out there on iTunes U. You can sort of do a virtual course if you like. And we also do a lot of academic work on science and faith. I'm somewhere in between because my project is all about communicating the results of my research to the general public. So one of my main outputs at the moment is a weekly blog on science and faith. So my first project at the Faraday Institute was, as Anthony said, was Test of Faith. And all the material is over there. Again, you've got a leaflet on your table. He said I was to promote my stuff, so I am. And that really starts from, wow, there's seemingly a conflict between science and faith. How do we sort this out? How do we respond to that? It's a test of faith. Is it a test of faith or is it not? Of course, the answer is, obviously your faith, as a Christian, my faith is intact as a scientist because, yes, it is a good thing for a Christian to do. But we go through all sorts of issues that I'm not going to talk about tonight. But you can have a look at that later on. Now what I'm working on, this is my blog, I chose, partly, I think it was Alistair McGrath who said something. I think there's a video clip buried in the Test of Faith website somewhere where he says, Christians are very good at responding to issues and controversies and Richard Dawkins and things, and often that's very important, and the Faraday Institute does that a lot. If a media story goes out, we offer someone to respond or phone them up, or sometimes they come to us and we provide an expert. And that's really important. But he said, we can't just leave it there, always on the back foot. We need to go on the front foot. We need to go out there starting the conversations. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm going to do today. Really kind of ignoring the controversies. We can talk about them later if you like, if you're interested to know what I think about different things. Overall, very happy with mainstream science and God. There you go. So just to give you a kind of broad overview of what I think. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, as you can tell from the title. This is a brain. It's a very beautiful drawing by someone I met this summer. You'll notice the little copyright down there, Dr. Lizzie Burns. You don't get many artists with a PhD in cell biology, but she's an interesting person. She doesn't have any particular faith commitment, but is very interested in science. Obviously, she trained as a scientist, did a couple of postdoctoral positions at Oxford University, and then all her life she'd always done a lot of drawing, and then decided that after doing a couple of exhibitions, getting some journal covers with her art, she went out as an artist drawing scientific subjects. And I wanted to start off with this because the reason I talked to her was because she just loves the beauty that you see in science. And these very delicate drawings, she really wanted to reflect the personal side of the brain. This is, okay, it's not a person, but it was a very integral part of a person. It's very personal, and she found it, it's something that could be quite, weird, odd, gross, whatever. If you are looking at a brain, she went and she looked at this brain, and she decided to do pencil drawings because it got across that, the intricacy of it, and something that's very personal and very effective way, I think. And it's also very beautiful. So I think I blogged on awe, and also have done Wonder and Beauty, but last week, and I asked people, what's your experience of awe? And I got loads of responses from people. I invited people from all sorts of different faith backgrounds, and they all said something. So people, when they're doing their work, I don't know if there are any scientists here. Can I see a show of hands, actually? Anyone who call themselves a scientist? Yes, one. Okay, welcome. Hello. And you can share with us later, would say, yes, there's something I see in my work and it's beautiful. And it usually when they've kind of come to the end of a series of experiments and have some results, and they can sit there and just think, wow, I've discovered something. And that's that moment of awe and appreciation of beauty in the world. So that's my background. And it's almost a kind of intuitive process just to look at something and say, wow, I like that. That's beautiful. And I wanted, with this project I'm working on now, to kind of unpick that intuitive process and figure out what's going on there, what of my cultural background informs that position, what about theology, is there anything helpful within that? And almost to kind of understand that intuitive process, to understand the logical steps within that. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to talk about beauty, a little bit about awe, and quite a lot about wonder in science. And the way that for a Christian that would can deepen your worship of God. I've got a lot of beautiful pictures. There's some cells. That's probably the closest thing to my subject on that picture there. That would deepen a worship of God. Many scientists do have faith. It is possible for scientists to have a faith. So these sometimes what are seen as two separate worlds, we can bridge those. Obviously, for a Christian who's a scientist, they are not separate worlds. They are one person who is both a Christian and a scientist. But I guess there are Christians who are not scientists. There are scientists who are not Christians. So in a way, they are separate worlds. But we can build bridges between them with the things I'm going to talk about. And also, as I said, I was challenged by Alistair McGrath and various other people. We can positively engage here. It's not just about always having to respond. We can start the conversation. So I'm going to start with something that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, definitely. You'll see how I, as a slightly odd biologist, see what I find beautiful. This is a worm. This is a time-lapse video. I think it's probably about 300 frames a second, so it's been speeded up. And this is, I think they're a few millimeters long. I haven't seen them since I was an undergrad, but I think they're about that big. They're transparent, so you can see every detail of their body. So I'll just show you this little video and see so you can see its intestinal tract all the way through the middle. See all these little cells? It's great. So, okay, I think it's beautiful. Another thing a beautiful concept about it is because it's so simple, 959 cells. You can pin it down to exact that. There's not any deviation in its development unless it has some kind of mutation. That makes it extremely useful as a model organism in biology. We can study some aspects of human disease using this worm because it's so tightly defined, its development is exactly programmed. We have too many cells to do the kind of studies we can do in a worm. Here's some pictures I got from a friend's lab. They have been treated with antibodies that carry a little fluorescent tag, and they recognize certain proteins, certain elements in that worm's body. So you can see exactly what's going on in here. If you choose your antibodies right, you can see things. I hope you can appreciate, at least it's a pretty color. It's much more fun to work on. I never liked those chemistry experiments at school where you ended up with brown sludge. I quite like this kind of stuff. And this guy, Jeff Hardin, he's a professor of zoology in the University of Wisconsin in the US. A good university there. The first time I peered down a microscope at a living sea urchin embryo, okay, he switched to worms later. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I was absolutely hooked on developmental biology. So this guy has a Christian faith, and I spoke to him about beauty last summer, and he absolutely loves what he does, and he wants to get that love across to his students, whatever faith they have. He often reads out Psalm 139 at the beginning of his lectures and says, whatever your faith commitment is, I want you to appreciate how beautiful the bodies are that develop. And I think that's great. Okay, maybe you can appreciate this a little bit more at face value. American national parks. John Muir was one of the people who was involved in setting up the national parks. He was a naturalist. He was a multitasker. He was into botany and geology mainly. He had a huge appreciation for nature, and that was enhanced by his scientific knowledge. And he roamed around these parks, literally, with a backpack and some bread. I would not have wanted to travel with this guy because he did not live a civilized life. He would just trek across with a donkey, and if he was lucky, and trek across these great tracts of land and find out all this beautiful stuff. But he writes amazingly about this, and I read his book while I was in the US. And reading the details of his work in natural history, I was able to appreciate more what I was seeing in the US. So as I walked around the forests, reading his book inspired me to look deeper. So I think scientific knowledge can often help you to appreciate what you see at a deeper level. Knowing, for example, why you get these wonderful colors in this hot spring, or the formation of these incredible sandstone formations, the age of these trees, thousands of years old, some of them. And he felt much closer to God when he was in nature. He'd had a slightly unfortunate experience with Christianity as a child, and decided to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but he felt close to God and was able to feel close to God in nature. So, scientific beauty. In thinking about this, I came up with about 4 categories. I stole some of them off my boss, Dennis Alexander, from a talk he did on beauty, but I came up with a few others. And so I've got 4 ways that a scientist might see beauty. So you can kind of understand, hopefully, a little bit of the eye of the beholder, whether you actually appreciate them or not yourself. I'll just explain what a scientist might see or might appreciate. First of all, they work on an experimental system. I'm a biologist, so I'm going to talk a lot about biology. This was my experimental system, the eye of the zebrafish. That's a cross-section. I think that's beautiful because I sent these little fish off to a lab in Germany, and they did, technically, this is really hard, to produce a section like this where the lens is so perfect, and to stain it so nicely. But one comes to appreciate the beauty of your experimental system. Maybe you choose it because you think it's beautiful already, or maybe from prolonged exposure, very prolonged exposure, you might come to appreciate it, you might be loyal to it, and you're certainly fascinated by it. Also, there's the beauty of a well-executed experiment. You've got this very nice section, which a very thin slice of the eye. Don't worry, the fish died happy in a bath of anesthetic. So, and it was very small. So slicing something that small, so thin, is really hard. I can appreciate how beautiful that is. Here's one of my experiments. I don't know if anyone's done PCR in this room. No. Yes, I'm seeing a nod. It's hard. So I blow my own trumpet. Here's very nice. Semi-quantitative RT-PCR. Ask me later what that means. But I got nice sharp-ish bands, but a nice tidy gel. And you might look at that and say, oh, it's very nice, beautiful gel. So there's almost an aspect of craftsmanship to what you do in the lab. And also creative solutions, especially if you don't have quite enough money or machinery's a little old, held together with tape and blue tack, which some of our stuff was. We mostly had very nice equipment in this MRC Human Genetics Unit. I'll give it a little plug there. But just occasionally, you want to save money, you keep something on for a bit longer, and creative solutions to get things working, or new things that you take on an experiment. You learn it from someone else, and you have to kind of cobble things a bit and try and figure out how it works. So the data, when you look at the data, you might think that is beautiful. There might be symmetry or order, simplicity, unity in it. Mathematicians are especially like this. They love beautiful equations. I'm still not quite sure what a beautiful equation is, but there's anyone who appreciates maths or physics. And some mathematicians would say there's a connection between the beauty of the equation and the truth of the equation. It's interesting. Then there's the way that you present the data and the way you treat the data. So you might end up with a lovely graph. I'll show you a little And the way you present it, you might choose to present nice, neat slides with different colours, or a video with something that twirls around, or the kind of antibody staining I showed you before with the worm that was, bright colours. Biologists love that kind of stuff. So, and you almost bring that yourself to the data, so you make it beautiful. You present it in beautiful ways. So there's the different ways that people might appreciate beauty, and you could probably come up with a whole load of other categories. But I think those are some of the things, just to give you a little insight into what scientists might think is beautiful. Yeah. So now we move on to a historian, a theologian. James Schaeffer is a lady from the States again. She studied medieval and patristic, so very early theologians, people like Augustine. And she looked at the way that they appreciated nature. Some of them were early scientists. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. They were studying nature, and they saw that as part of their worship of God. And there were different ways that she kind of came up with several categories, 5 categories of different ways that they appreciated nature. So this is one step on from what I just showed you, the scientific ways of appreciating nature. Once you've got that thing you think is beautiful, how does that affect you? First of all, there's a simple emotional appreciation. That's pretty. Here's a bee on a flower. You might sit in your garden with a cup of tea on a warm day and enjoy the bees buzzing around the garden. You just enjoy what you see. Secondly, emotional rational appreciation. So you might see the bees buzzing around your garden and enjoy the fact that they're making honey, because you know that's a small scientific detail. That little deeper scientific study, you might know things about flowers, you might remember things you learned about school, you might remember the slightly yucky fact that they kind of eat the pollen and then digest it and regurgitate it, but somehow that tastes good as honey. You might think that's cool or funny or I don't know what, but it's kind of a mixture of emotional, rational appreciation. Secondly, you could go purely rational. You could start thinking about numbers maybe, and start thinking, well, there must be hundreds of bees in my garden. Think about the numbers of bees worldwide, the amount of honey they've made. Or maybe you start thinking in great detail about the structure of the flower. Maybe you get a book out or look it up on the internet. You have a question you want to find out, and you see a little diagram. So you start thinking in more abstract ways. Maybe you're just amazed. Maybe you just sit there and think, they're so small, but they're so clever. They do this little waggle dance to communicate where the best flowers are. You might just be overwhelmed by the magnitude and the complexity of the universe. These thousands of bees, millions, billions probably all over the world, all making their honey. And then you might come to something spiritual, and you might say the world that God has created shows us something about him. God is an incredible provider. What an amazing creator to have made something so complex. So you could say all sorts of things like that. So here's a poem I like, a section from a very long poem. Earth crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. Okay, and I've heard this quoted a number of times actually. Jeff Hardin, the worm guy, he thinks of this when he teaches his students. He doesn't want them to just sit there, I'll write it down, and then, write it down again in the exam. He wants them to really see it and really appreciate what is in front of their eyes. And I like that. So now we get on to a little bit of theology about beauty. In the Old Testament, looking through, it doesn't talk a lot about beauty in the way that we would. It does talk about how creation reveals God's glory, his generosity, his faithfulness. It talks about the beauty of the land and everything that's in it that God has given to us. I think that's a very positive thing when you're a scientist. And as I said, my last slide, the first theologians, the church fathers, people like Augustine, here he is, that was for some of them, it was a really important part of their faith journey, was to look at the world around them, and that showed them something of God. So that is right there, if you're a Christian, right there at the beginning in your Christian heritage. Doing basic study of natural history brings people closer to God. medieval theologians a little bit later on. This is Albert the Great. He was one of the first people to say, come on guys, let's get out in the field. Let's study things and pick them up and count them and collect them and get back in the, they probably didn't call it a laboratory, but get back inside and start picking things apart and looking at them and doing experiments. And he was really encouraging people to do that and saw that as part of his worship of God. So the very early scientists were motivated by their faith to do that. And for them, when they studied creation, that helped them to understand something about God. Is that a conversation starter? I think it is, actually, because Elaine Eklund, she's a sociologist at Rice University in, I think it's Texas. I might have got that wrong. She's actually doing a study here in the UK now and in a number of other countries, so hopefully I'll have some data. I have data of US scientists in elite universities in the States. So these are places where actually, here I'm not sure, in a science department, people are generally not that bothered what your faith commitment is. They realize, they have the history of philosophy of science where they realize that I can do an experiment, a Muslim can do an experiment, and so long as we do it well, what's the problem? When your motivations for doing things might be different, but you do the experiment. Okay, I wouldn't say science is completely neutral. We're human beings, and that's why we have peer review and we do lab meetings and everybody looks at each other's data. But I think in general, it's not a problem. In the US, it's a little bit more political. So in elite university, people are a little bit cautious about what they're saying. But she did find that about half of them were religious. I think a lot of the others they have Christian universities there as well, where unfortunately the standard of, they're mainly teaching universities, so there's not a lot of exciting experimental work happening in the Christian universities. So this is kind of odd dynamic happening in the States. But in these elite universities, you found half of them were religious of some sort. About 30% were atheists, so quite a high figure for the States compared to the general population. 20%, this is interesting, were spiritual. They didn't want to connect themselves with a religion of any sort, but they said, yes, I am spiritual. There is something out there. Mainly, they didn't want to compartmentalize their lives and have a faith that they left outside the door when they came in. They wanted to be whole persons, so that's a good thing. I think hopefully everyone here would agree with that. And I think they valued this experience of something beauty, the aesthetics of what they were doing. They had experiences of awe and wonder, and that was important to them, and they felt they had experienced something meaningful that wasn't just to do with atoms and molecules. And they may not have used the word transcendent, but they felt that they had experienced something meaningful. And that motivated both their teaching and other things, their ethics for life. So there, I think, that's really interesting. And I want to dive in and start talking. And, where do you have that sort of experience? And, I have that too. Let's talk. So talking about beauty in the character of God, I don't think that's too big a leap. Here's another painting by Lizzie Burns, again, the scientist artist. This is a representation of a hormone molecule, which I think is interesting. So the beauty of God, I love this verse. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. And that's from Psalm 27. So that's the kind of concept of the beauty of God. Now, Plato had the idea, I got this from Alistair McGrath again, he said there were two ways of seeing beauty in the natural world. Plato had this idea, the Greek philosopher, that you ascended from this earthly beauty, this was somehow inferior, people or things or animals that you might think were beautiful, and you had to kind of ascend to a higher plane mentally to think about things that were spiritually beautiful, that was better. But Alistair McGrath, theologian here in London now, was in Oxford, said that the Christian idea of beauty is that the physical stuff is good. God made the universe and he declared it good. And that reveals something about God. Okay, as a Christian, I would also believe that there's something wrong in the world. We do wrong. The world isn't the way it should be. it's groaning in some way, and I don't think you can deny that really, if you look at what's happening in the world. But there's still something, maybe like a fuzzy mirror or a cracked window. You can see something about God. It's as if the world is transparent in a way to the transcendent, to God. So 3 things, I think. I got some astronomy pictures here. That's one of the biggest sources of wow for so many people, I think. You just stare up at the night sky, which I did yesterday, looking at all these different constellations, and the phase 2 of the Hubble telescope, where they've just added extra optics and things, so you can see even further and even brighter. Actually, is being run by a Christian, Jennifer Wiseman, who's the chief scientific project officer, I think, for the Hubble telescope. She's a Christian, and this is part of her worship, and that's great. So 3 things I think we can tell by looking at the universe. I think we need to be very cautious about this, not just to make stuff up, but I think these things are, having run them by a number of theologians, I think are fairly biblical. First of all, there's the beauty of God, which I talked about in that psalm, that the beauty of creation reflects something of the beauty of God. That's almost quite a simple, intuitive process that a lot of people will find when they've been on a long walk or they stand on top of a mountain, that helps them to worship God. Something a bit kind of harder to think about, the idea that creation is a harmonious work of art. This was very popular with the medieval theologians, that they would see all these different interactions. And that was with very basic science. We have the privilege of seeing even more incredible interactions. They thought this reflected something of the wisdom and unity of the Trinity. God is an interconnected being. And he's made an interconnected, complex worlds where things have to relate to each other. I don't know what you think of that, but I thought that was interesting. Finally, you can't deny that there is symmetry, there's pattern, there's order in the universe, and science reveals that. It's not something you invent, it's something you discover. And I think that reflects the wisdom and the truth of the ultimate lawgiver. This is a God who created a world in his grace that behaves in regular ways, and I'm glad he did, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get on with our lives. We'd be worried about things dropping out of the sky on our heads, or when do I plant my crops, because goodness knows when it's going to be warm. We have the seasons and order of things. So by way of introduction to the next half, we've done beauty. That was beauty. Now we're going to do awe and wonder. I'm going to tell you a story that I think should fill you with awe and wonder. This is DNA. I'm a child of the DNA era. My biology degree was full of this. Every cell in our bodies, apart from the lens of our eye and our red blood cells, they have to get rid of the DNA in those ones to make space for other things. But every other cell in our body is packed full of 2 meters of DNA. It's very, 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 very thin. And it's rolled up very, very, very tightly, a little bit like your telephone cable. There's a coil, then there's another coil. If you're a fiddler and you have a telephone with a cable, there's another coil. And if you're really bad, there's another coil. And if your cat gets hold of it, there's another way of coiling it. And it ends up in this tight ball. DNA is a bit like that. It's more ordered than a twisted telephone cable, highly ordered, and there are other proteins involved, but managed to get 2 meters of DNA into a cell that you couldn't see with the naked eye. That's already you're saying, wow, this is even better. Somebody told me once I had enough DNA in my body to go to the moon and back, which I thought was pretty impressive. So this little girl, woo, she's quite excited about that. I'm not going to try it, it'd be too sore. But I started having a look around, checking on the internet, seeing things. Is it true? So I did a little sum. I don't like numbers, so I got a friend who's a cosmologist to check this for me later. How many cells in a human body? There are about 50 trillion cells, so that's 12 knots after the 50. In the average adult body, somewhere between 10 and 100. It's pretty hard to count, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. So that's the hardest thing to guess. The other stuff we know better. We know there's about 2 meters of DNA. So that's about 100 trillion meters, or 100 billion kilometers. Sorry I did it metric. If you can't relate to that, I'm sorry. It's a big number. That's how much DNA you have in your body. So that's kind of hard to visualize. So let's think about the moon, 38,000 kilometers. That's nothing compared to 100 billion kilometers. So we'll go a bit further. We'll go to the sun, which is 380,000 kilometers. 150 million kilometers. So how many times can the DNA in your body go to the sun and back? If you're good with numbers, as I'm sure some of you are here, you already have worked out 100 billion divided by 150 million divided by 2 is, anyone? About 400? 300 and something, yeah. 333 times to the sun back. I find that incredible. I still, even now, still can't really get my head around it. Big distances, but my body, many times to the sun and back. We are truly and wonderfully made. So, talking about awe and wonder, here's a little boy experiencing a moment of awe. Maybe he just saw his big sister's new bike. Maybe he saw a large spider in the back garden. He has seen something, could be any one of these things, or several: vast, powerful, beautiful, complex, incomprehensible. I think incomprehensible is important there. Something that really makes you think. You might feel a bit overwhelmed, certainly surprised, full of wonder, which I'll unpick in a minute, admiration maybe, bit of fear, reverence, respect maybe. Maybe it's a really fast car and he's thinking, whoa, you know. There's an aspect of mental adjustment that has to go on that's very important. So that's awe. And when I talked to, as I said, when I talked to my scientific colleagues about that, I blogged on it last week and I invited a number of people to comment, and nobody said, load of rubbish, never experienced awe in the lab. The people who found time to respond said yes and told a story, which was great. Now, wonder requires a little bit more thought. This little boy is having a bit of a wonder about something. Daddy, what's that? Can we look? Can I hold it? There's something new, unexpected, maybe beautiful, a bit strange, puzzling. It's made him surprised. So this is kind of a subset of the awe feelings. Amazement, probably admiration. Maybe it's a funny spider. Daddy, can I look? Can I hold it? Curiosity, fascination. And I think doubt is an interesting one, because I think often the things that make us wonder will make us think, oh, I thought it was like this, but actually, maybe it's like that instead. And you start wanting, as a scientist, to go and do an experiment. So that's where we are now culturally, with our history, in the West in general. I think thinking about awe and wonder, there's a massive literature, I got slightly bogged down in it, on the concept of wonder. It's fascinating. That's how we understand it now. And it's almost as if wonder is the positive subset of awe, and the active subset. It's the kind that makes you go, look, oh, you know, and you start wanting to poke it and look at it. And actually, having said the West, I'm going to tell you a story about a Chinese friend who experienced something very similar. So I think we're global now. So wonder, as the Greek philosophers used to teach, is the root of knowledge. It's that, whoa, that gets you asking questions, maybe marks out the limits. For Christian, I got this from a theologian, Celia Dean Drummond, saying that wonder marks out the limits of what is natural, the resurrection of Jesus. That would get you wondering. And also, especially for scientists, but for anyone else interested in anything, marks out the limits of our understanding. Wow, I want to know more about that. Interestingly, I think wonder and wisdom are very closely related. This is Celia Dean Drummond again, who wrote a wonderful book on wonder and wisdom, talking about how wonder really drives learning. Children are brilliant at that. Wonder, for Christian, I think is open to the transcendent. I think allowing yourself to be surprised, and I'll think about that in a minute. Wisdom is directing inquiry, so it's, you know, is it sensible to touch the spider? You know, maybe not. Maybe, you know, poke it with a stick, or whatever. Wisdom prevents self-deception. I think especially for Christians, you don't want to be too skeptical, because you're going to throw everything out. But then you don't want to be too credulous. Someone tells you a story, really? How do you know? Asking questions. So I want to go a little bit back to thinking about our cultural heritage. One little area I realized was important is the Romantic movement. This was a long cultural movement and very, very affected a huge number of countries, had a massive effect on our literature, music, art. We've thrown some of it now, we've kind of said, well, that's a little bit cheesy, but a lot of it we do still appreciate a lot. Here is Turner's picture, and I stood in the National Gallery a few weeks ago and looked at it, and there was a big crowd around it. This is influenced by the Romantic movement, so people they're thinking about emotion, they're using their imaginations, they're thinking about untamed nature. This is partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, partly a reaction to the philosophical movement, the Enlightenment, where people had everything very cut and dried and rational. So the Romantic movement kind of burst out of that and said, no, let's use our imaginations, let's talk about wild, untamed nature, exotic things, let's have creative geniuses, the kind of the lone person in the room dreaming up some kind of mad, crazy, brilliant book, recognizing the value of wonder and awe. And I think that actually has informed a lot of what we think about. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I think as I look back through the history of cultural movements, I think, okay, we've probably not kept the best of all of them, but I think it is important to think about nature in that kind of way and be open to be surprised by it. So, G.K. Chesterton was a master of this, author, philosopher, amateur theologian. He wrote a book called Tremendous Trifles, which is actually free online. And he told a story at the beginning of this of two kids called Peter and Paul. And they were playing in a very boring front garden. I'm sure their parents thought it was wonderful, but they probably weren't terribly stimulated. Two small boys in a very small front garden. A fairy came along and offered them a wish. Paul chose to be turned into a giant, roamed around the world, found it all very small and silly, got bored, lay down for a nap, and got his head chopped off by a woodcutter. There you go. Peter, on the other hand, chose to become very small, very, very small indeed. And instantly, the garden looked very exciting. It was this huge, untamed jungle with masses of tall green things and amazing trees, and he just set off on a massive adventure around the garden. And G.K. Chesterton used this as an illustration of how we can, just by noticing what is in the normal around us, he used this phrase, show how many extraordinary things even a lazy and ordinary man may see if he can spur himself to the single activity of seeing. And here's an example of an author. This is great. They've got a website, slinkertube.com, where they've made things out of, they've added very tiny people to it's a wet tennis shoe. Honestly, it's just a wet tennis shoe, but he's made it into an adventure, which is great. But you could also apply that to science. That's kind of what some scientists do for a living. They look at these things and really, what is it? What is it? What is it? Closer and closer, and, really wanting to know about it. So these are adventures of the mind. This is a way of cultivating wonder. And also some things I got from a theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, he's written a couple of chapters on wonder in some of his books, who's very keen on this, and he said we need to be open to what the world has to show us. Obviously, being discerning, I wouldn't want to be open to anything evil, but being open to what the world has to show us, paying attention. Astonishment is part of wonder. And astonishment, he said, is remarkably close to presence of mind. If you have the presence of mind there, then, you will be astonished by what you see. Here's Joshua Bell, violinist, and Washington Post did a publicity stunt where they put him in the Washington Underground at rush hour, and nobody stopped. hardly anybody stopped. They would pay $100 for a ticket in a concert hall. And eventually one lady, you can see it on YouTube, just Google Joshua Bell on YouTube, you'll find it. Eventually somebody stopped and said, "Oh my goodness, I saw you in the concert hall last night. You were so amazing." I guess in Britain the equivalent would be, "Is that Joshua Bell? Sorry, I will not bother him." Okay, I think I just saw Joshua Bell. Okay, but anyway, so he got a good American response. Their commute, everyday commute, became a unique event, and most people didn't notice. Jürgen Moltmann said, we need to recognize that every event only happens once, and we need to be open to what it has to show. And the most astonishing thing is that we exist. Oh, there's a unique event, Northern Lights, on a beautiful night. The wonder of existence. He said, this is the most wonderful thing, that we're actually here, and everything we know stems from that fact. There's a humility in that. So, more Alistair McGrath, wonder at creation. He had 3 ways of looking at this. First of all, there's the intuitive wonder. This is a bit like my beauty classification, just taking it all in. A kind of immediate emotional reaction. You stand on top of a mountain and you see that. Then there's the derived wonder. Again, the sort of mathematical, theoretical treatment of it that helps you to appreciate it even more. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then there's a derived wonder, a second kind, that if I am a Christian, or I've understood any kind of theology, I might get me starting thinking about God. For example, the mathematical wonder, you might look at this flower, and if I was a mathematician, I could explain to you about Fibonacci numbers and how that kind of pattern in the universe describes lots of things, including this the pattern of I think they're called stamens in this flower. Or if I was a theologian, I could talk about creation reflecting something of the personality of the creator, like I did with beauty. But let's start with wonder in science again, just to explain a little bit of the history here, or a little bit of the way scientists behave. I've picked some old scientists. I guess they can't complain about what I say about them. Ernst Mach was a physicist, and he thought wonder was no great shakes. Yeah, okay, maybe it drives science. Adam Smith thought this too. He was an Enlightenment philosopher from Edinburgh. He thought wonder, yeah, it's useful for getting people to think, but we need to get rid of it. We need to quickly investigate things so that we reduce everything down to its nuts and bolts, and then we don't have wonder anymore. Wonder's a bit uncomfortable. We like to know how things work. Ernst Mach thought that. He thought, yeah, you might get a bit disillusioned when you just see a pile of nuts and bolts. The thing that they made was much more exciting, but tough. That's just what science does. Einstein comes along and says, no, that's boring. I do science because the most fascinating and surprising thing about the world is that we can make sense of it. That's amazing. And that's what drove him, I think, as a scientist. And he thought that was an incredible source of wonder. So you never get rid of that. The more you go, the more wonder you get. So they're kind of 2 opposing views in a way. One way to make sense of it is to think about, using the word sense in lots of ways. Science is about sense making. It's about making sense of things. And that, as I said before, is something you discover. You don't invent it, you find it. You find patterns and order in things. And that's amazing. It's like an unexpected gift. You start looking at things and weighing and measuring. I'll tell you an example. There were a historian of science called Olaf Pedersen, who's Danish, and he started life as a science teacher. And old-fashioned classroom, old-fashioned textbook, taught an old-fashioned way, and said, we're going to learn about the specific gravity of lead, that's weight divided by volume. It's 11.4 grams per meter squared. So now I want you to weigh and measure these pieces of lead and see if you can get the same value, 11.4. So these 11-year-old kids, bless them, got their bit of lead, got their rulers out, put it on the balance, and of course they're 11 and they've got a school ruler and a school scales. So they didn't get 11.4, and they got very bored very quickly, and it was just all a waste of time. and they didn't take it in. So the next time, he did it differently. Next year, fresh class of 11-year-olds, and he gave them a piece of lead and said, weigh it, measure it, enter the results on a table on the board. So they did that, and they ended up with these 2 columns, and he said, right, let's do some maths. So they all started dividing things and adding the columns, and they just got nonsense, complete nonsense. And then eventually they started dividing one column by the other. They started getting similar, all these different weights and measurements. They started to divide the weight by the volume. They got something 11 point something, and they started going, sir, what's going on? Why these? What's this? What's happening? Why do we get the same number? And started asking all these questions and coming out, and which was the perfect opportunity for him to say, well, now I can tell you about the specific gravity of lead. And they were listening, maybe for about 5 minutes. But they were captured, not because they discovered something new. They knew they could have opened their textbook and found it out. But it's like that gift of discovery of this kind of making sense that happened in science that filled them with wonder. Max Planck was a famous physicist who said, the order you find in science is discovered by very different people. They're not all mystics like Einstein, people who are really looking for some kind of spiritual meaning in the universe. They're very different kinds of people. And they all discover this kind of order. Okay, you maybe get personality types, which I think are rare in science, like Ernst Mach, who don't find that wonderful. Fair enough, I think he's missing out. But most people would find that incredibly wonderful. Here's another story of a mathematician who, as an infant, so I guess he must have been about 2 or 3 or something, that's what he described himself as, he's fascinated by circles, and he collected them. Like little, milk bottle tops and top of a cheese tub or, whatever. He just collected these things in his cupboard, and he'd draw around them to make circles on paper. And his parents spotted this and thought, oh, that's nice. Let's encourage this. So they said, we're going to buy you something, and it can make a circle of any size. It's a magical, it's this machine that can make a circle of any size. And he was so excited. And a little bit like Ernst Mach's, slightly ignorant person who doesn't know the answer yet and has got very excited about circles. Then they gave him a compass. I think this looks like an instrument of torture. But it's not circular. Okay, he was expecting some kind of wonderful, expanding, collapsing circle. But it's not circular, and there's this kind of simplicity to it. You change it, and it makes a circle. He got really bored. He was like, yeah, whatever. He wasn't excited by it. And he actually remembered it as a traumatic moment in his childhood, that this disillusionment with this, what he thought was going to be a magical machine, but it was just a compass. So that's like Ernst Mach's disillusioned person. He was all excited about a mystery, and then they find out the scientific answer, and they just, well, I've got the answer, but I'm a bit disillusioned. But like Einstein, as he got older, he studied maths, he came back to the compass, and he began to really appreciate the elegance and the simplicity of this machine, and he could understand things about circles that were very wonderful and very beautiful. So he had this deeper sense of wonder. So I think Einstein was right. I think science does not get rid of wonder, I think it increases it. I tried this on a Chinese friend who's a mathematician. I found out he studies circles. He studied Pascal's theorem in high school, didn't really understand it, but thought it was beautiful. There was something cool about it. He then went as a senior student in the university studying graduate level maths. He really got to understand Pascal's theorem properly, something about circles. I'm not a mathematician, so I don't really know what it is. And he said, I use his words, he said, it appears even more wonderful to me. There are many such wonders in mathematics, which have been serving as a motivation for my study in mathematics. And I am on my way to discover more such deep wonders. So that's one of his big drivers. So there's someone from a completely different culture who's experiencing this deeper sense of wonder. So let me just go on to a video of a biologist. I told you I'd talk about some scientists who were Christians. This guy is definitely a Christian and is talking about the wonder he sees in his subject. So.
I think very few people are not scientists unless they are in some way inspired. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's mostly actually a life of disappointments, either because your rival gets to the answer first, or because what appears to be a very promising line of inquiry actually turns into dust and ashes. But despite all that, one does learn things genuinely. One actually genuinely advances knowledge. One does find particular examples of, if you like, coordination and the synthesis of form, which are dazzlingly impressive. And I think many, many scientists, when you read their anecdotal lives rather than the laboratory notebooks, will freely admit that what they see around them is extraordinary. I think that's certainly true of astronomers. I think it's even more true, at least I hope it is, of molecular biologists, because, fine, we know a great deal about molecular biology. Astonishing advances are being made, but on the other hand, the way a cell works, the density of the chemicals within it, the sophistication and the operation of these things. It sounds, again, as if I'm trying to smuggle in a theistic argument. It's not the way I'm trying to argue. It's simply saying that these things are dazzlingly complex, and yet emerge, even in the case of things like our intelligence, from rather simple background. And you can take a materialist view and say, well, yes, that's the way those chemicals come together. But I would sort of keep on standing back and say, well, no, wait a minute, hang on. We are dealing with a rather precise set of arrangements, and the number of alternatives, as I think evolutionary convergence shows, is a hint that there are deeper organisational principles at work, but those are things which are scientific questions.
So he's very cautious. He's a professor of paleobiology at Cambridge, and very cautious, kind of Cambridge manner, saying, kind of gets me thinking about God. I'm not trying to say it's proof, but it kind of gets me thinking about God, the stuff I see in my work. So let me just skip over a couple of things. 5 minutes left. We're nearly there. You're all staying awake. I'm impressed. Wonder in theology. Okay. Does God wonder? I'll betray my denominational background and I say this. I don't think so. I think he knows everything. But he creates wonders, and I'll talk about the Bible passages later that I think go into that. We wonder. Somebody said that was because we're made in God's image. If I don't think God wonders, I'm not sure that works, but I would like to think about it. I'm sure some of you are much better, are actually trained theologians. Would like to think that's part of a gift that God has given us to us, so that we can fulfill his commission and go out into the world and use it in a good way to glorify him and study it. And as I said, wonder can lead to wisdom and vice versa. Food for thought. Wonder in the Bible. Interestingly, if you do a quick scan on Bible Gateway, there's about twice as many mentions of wonder than awe in the Bible. Okay, in my NIV, there's about 100 mentions of wonder and about 50 odd of awe. I think because God wants us to think. He does, in the Old Testament, he does signs and wonders. He gets us wondering and thinking, who is this God? What did he do? He does wonderful deeds. He demonstrates his wonderful love and his wonderful law, thinking about Old Testament law. So God is a doer of many wonders that get people wondering about things. In the New Testament, it just continues and gets even more puzzling. We have Jesus appearing, not being a great king, riding in on a big horse, crushing the enemy and creating some kind of earthly kingdom. But he does these incredible miracles. He does this wise teaching. And there are this course of events that people just, who is this child who was born? Who is this jumped up carpenter who seems to know so much? Why did he just die? All these things that happen that get people wondering. That is the way that God works, through wonder. But wonder is ambiguous. It tends to, when people experience God and he gets them wondering, it tends to lead to decision. But either way, it could get them to believe, it could get them to, they might go away in disbelief if they, I think if they haven't been paying attention to the whole sweep of Jesus' teaching. They might just see a bit of it, which I think is why Jesus didn't just work wonders for the sake of it. Water into wine was to demonstrate something. God's kingdom is coming. and they were for a reason, but he resisted when people said, do it. Go on, do something amazing. He would say, I could do any number of amazing things, and it still wouldn't convince you to believe. You'd go away and explain it away in your mind. But as a whole package, looking at Jesus' ministry as a whole, the wonder of what he did is important. So I'm going to skip over these guys. I have two theologians, Jürgen Moltmann, who is basically the message that he said, wonder is the best attitude. And I love this quote. We need to approach God with wonder, otherwise we could come to think the products of our religious fantasy are God and notice nothing of the living God. We need to be open to what God is like, neither making up random things that are not wonderful or too wonderful or whatever. We need to actually pay attention to God and what he says about himself. And I'll skip over that quote as I'm trying to finish. Karl Barth, serious evangelical theologian, same thing. God is so wonderful. So a theologian should be constantly filled with wonder or quit. Okay, at times you need to, well, he didn't use those words, but pretty much what he said. He used very harsh words, actually, saying, anyone who's not filled with wonder needs to really seriously consider whether they should be doing this subject at all. Because salvation, he said, was the greatest wonder. And he thought that doing theologian should profoundly change the theologian, even in appearance. He thought this person should have a different demeanor because they are seeing, they're being confronted by the wondrous reality of the living God every single day. If God is really there and it's really true, it should change them. They're privileged enough to study theology. And I find this part comforting. He said, as long as even a poor theologian is capable of astonishment, he is not lost, hopefully she, to the fulfillment of his or her task. So this kind of balance of, you need to have the analytical aspects of it, but then you need to balance it with a contemplation of God, a worship of God. Wonder in theology. This is a Canadian theologian, Glenn Scorgie, who said it's an antidote to skepticism. God should be allowed to surprise us. Stimulus to inquiry. When you think you've got it all mastered and taped down, worry. God is continually revealing himself to us in ways that are appropriate to our culture. Same timeless message in new ways. I don't need to click. Re-spiritualizing theology in a way. He used the word re-religionize, but I don't think the word religion goes down very well now. To me, it's really negative, but engaging with the transcendent. We need to stop, put down the books and go, that's true. That's amazing, and should turn into worship and praise. And I think for the normal churchgoer as well, I think that's important. We all do theology, we all study God. So there we are, that's where we've been. We've thought about beauty, awe and wonder in science, how that might deepen worship of God, how scientists can, or many do, have faith. There is this bridge between these worlds. They're these conversation starters. How do you experience a beauty in your work? What does it make you think about? Is there some kind of other reality? What is that? Have you really thought about it? And really engaging positively, telling those stories. Simon Conway Morris, the paleontologist, with him seeing this order, these incredible things emerging through this process, you can see, he's studying fossils, but, that really makes him think about God. People say science has disproved God. Well, there are tons of people who don't think so. So I'll leave you with that. And there are many resources on many websites, including those where you can take this further. So.
Okay, so let's begin then with the whole area of beauty. Has anyone got anything around this they'd like to say or ask? Yes, thank you.
In the interlude, we were just chatting about the business of beauty. Ruth, I'd like to ask you, I can see if you're already a Christian, the beauty that you were describing and showing us would fit, I suppose, with your concept of God. But what would need to happen if you're not already a Christian to move from what I would see as the impersonal, formal qualities of beauty, shape, size, color, all the things you were showing us, to something which strikes me as personal, which was your phrase, the character of God.
Yeah, so in between is discovering who Jesus is. So I think for me it's an interesting, have I unmuted myself? Yes, I have. For me it's something interesting, and it's people feel they can't talk to a scientist without bringing up some great debate about creation, or they feel they've got nothing in common with the scientist. So I think it's a bridge. Here I have something in common with you. I appreciate beauty. Do you appreciate beauty? But then, if one wants to explain one's faith, you have to do that, talking about other things. So I don't think it's really a proof for God. It's certainly not a proof for what a Christian would believe, the gospel. So there's a lot in between there that, is to do with a whole load of other stuff. And actually there's a website called BioLogos, and they publish a lot of different stuff. They have a daily blog, hugely wide-ranging in topic, and a guy I worked with over the summer called James May, another Londoner, wrote a paper on the value of beauty and the humanities. So he's trying to say, well, outside of science, there's this whole other range of stuff that is important. And we get into philosophy and theology and, everything else. So it's kind of this whole other world you have to explore, as well as, I think if someone prides themselves on being properly open-minded, that's worth exploring as well as the science.
Thank you. We were talking on that table, weren't we, about how you get from things like form and colour and shape and symmetry and so on to the character of God, even if you are a Christian.
It's really abstract.
What's the organic connection between those things and understanding facets of God's character?
I think it's pretty intuitive, really. It's hard to... I think if God... the way I'd explain it to young people, which we'll probably do...
No, that will do fine for us as well.
Yeah, it's like if you make something and you're proud of it and you'd say it is good, it reflects something of your character.
Yeah.
So if I see the beauty and the order and everything else in there, then I believe in God, I think, well, that makes sense, Yeah. I think it's hard to go... I'm really cautious with this is natural theology. I'm very cautious with this and very influenced by Alistair McGrath, as you can tell, because he says it's much, rather than using it as evidence or proof for God, it's more helpful to think of it as a kind of lens that you might look through, which if you weren't a Christian, that would be as a thought experiment, I think. What would you expect if, I think.
That's helpful, thank you, Ruth. Other things on beauty? Questions that were raised? Yes, please, thank you. And then we'll go with that.
Just a question about, so as a biologist, do you see a selective advantage to the existence of the experience of beauty? So is there something inherently useful to an organism in understanding the concept of beauty?
That's great.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's great.
Yeah, I think there's a book called Survival of the Beautiful, and whereas the biologist, it's a popular level science book, secular science book, where I haven't read it, but I think that's his argument, is that yes, there is a selective advantage. So you could almost use that to explain it away and say, well, it's just stuff, we like symmetry and that's just inbuilt in us. But then I'd say again, if you do the thought experiment, if God existed and he made us, of course it'd be inbuilt, so you can kind of take it two ways, and that's not really a decider for me. I don't believe in God because of anything to do with science at all. I believe in God because of other stuff. Changes I've seen in people's lives in answer to prayer, and in a way different experiments in the human realm and in the spiritual realm. So that's kind of why I said it was more of a conversation starter. But Yeah.
Thank you. Was there someone on the back? Yeah. No? Okay.
Does anyone ever want to respond and say, I think something differently?
To come back, if you yourself have insights on these questions, do feel free to come back on them, please.
It's not a ask me any question and I know the answer game. It's not.
Anyone else over here? Yeah.
We've just been watching the David Attenborough 60 years. So it's 3 programs. He spent 60 years looking at creation, seeing the most stunningly beautiful things, and he still comes to the conclusion that this is the survival of the fittest. That's just unbelievable, in my mind, unbelievable stupidity.
Yeah, I think for him, the reason he doesn't believe in God...
I missed who that was.
David Attenborough.
Oh, David Attenborough, sorry.
I think he doesn't... I mean, I've heard this from other people, but I've not read his books or seen his programs, but I think the reason he doesn't believe in God is because of the suffering. He's seen, a little worm boring into a child's eye and making it blind, which for him, and I think for us, is one of the hardest questions to address. I actually, when I've done my beauty talk before, I've gone straight on to suffering, because that's often the first question that comes up. I didn't tonight, because I think it almost distracts from thinking about the cool stuff. But I think we do have to address that. Why do we see this suffering? I mean, I would say it's partly, we're broken, the world's not the way, this life isn't the way it's meant to be. It is good, it is beautiful, but it's not, it's groaning, and God suffered for us, with us. He's still in control, but yeah.
Well, maybe that's something we can come back to a little bit more towards the end. Any more on the whole area of beauty that we were exploring, or maybe move into area of wonder, awe, and so on that Ruth was exploring in the second part of this evening? Yeah, Jay?
This is a personal thing. I'm absolutely blown away by the DNA stats that you put out there. And over the last couple of years, I mean, I've seen a couple of DVDs that Louis Giglio has done, and also, just speaking about the massiveness of the universe and how small we are, but also how much God is holding us together at a cellular level. And it blows me away, and the idea of, as a fetus is growing, my wife is a midwife, and she wows me with stories of how the eye, so the nerve endings coming out of the brain, meet up with their exact opposites of nerve endings coming out of the retina at the back of the eye, and it just blows me away. And so that wonder is something that I absolutely revel in. My question is, you said earlier that wonder helps you to define limits, and I wonder how do you hold in balance the tension between discovery and amazement and wanting to know more, and some of the ethical questions that could come alongside those questions of discovery as well? How do you, as a scientist and as a biologist, how do you balance those, and also as a Christian? Yeah,
I think that's where wisdom comes in. I think that wisdom has to guide wonder, that as you do explore, you can't just open-eyed, wide-eyed run into everything. I mean, Einstein deeply regretted being part of the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. I mean, okay, they thought they were doing the right thing. And, Alistair McGrath himself, I mean, he did a PhD in biochemistry and then realized, partly through his PhD, as someone said, you don't think we're just messing around with chemicals for nothing, do you? This is, these are going to be used for things. You've got to think about what we're being used. And he realized, some of the chemicals that people make would be used in, chemical warfare. And found that deeply repellent. And I think we do need to think about, there's no such thing as value-free science. I mean, okay, the data in a way is value-free, but what you do with it is value-laden. And John Polkinghorne, whose quote I missed off, is the one slide I missed, something else he said. He's a physicist who's well known for having left his physics in his 40s, become a vicar, and then got really involved in science and religion. He's written tons of books. But he said he was involved in ethics committees for a while. And he said once you've taken the technology off the shelf, it's pretty much impossible to put it back again. It's out, it's there, it's gone. So I think we do need to think really carefully about, and I think the general public, I mean, certainly on medical ethics committees, I think often they need lay people to be on them. So, there is the opportunity for everyone to be involved in that kind of discussion. So I think it is important, not to be just naive. And thankfully, in a lot of scientific grant proposals, there's a lot of that kind of thinking. How are you going to communicate this to the public? How could this be used? Whatever. Thankfully, I think people are usually very well aware of, how things might be used. Often your problem is more that, the technological use is a generation away. You have to motivate yourself to keep going, even though, you're probably not, you might not live to see it being used. Sometimes the ethics isn't a problem, but.
Thank you, Ruth. Again, if anyone wants to come back on some of these points, please do. I personally was interested when you were talking earlier. You said a few times just now and earlier on in your talk, science is not value-free and so on. But popularly, certainly, it would appear to me, science is often presented popularly as a kind of it's objective, neutral, hard. Data tells us facts about the world, and that's what really matters. Whereas you've opened our eyes to different perspectives, the notion of wonder, the notion of awe, the notion of wisdom. Could you talk a little bit more about those things and what the implications of that for a Christian view of knowledge, of how we know things in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's largely about having a decent philosophy of science. I think the kind of objective, value-free idea is quite old-fashioned philosophy of science. And unfortunately, I think there are some popularizers of science who just don't value philosophy. And they're very kind of old-fashioned, what you call logical positivists, that, you got your hard facts and that's what it's all about. And that's probably a rubbish description of logical positivism. And I think one or two people, I'm not quite sure what Dawkins' take on the ethics is, but I certainly know that his kind of philosophy of science is, that's what it is. It's the kind of hard-nosed, value-free kind of thing. And I think it would be good if science students did have to do history and philosophy of science. I think that would be great to give people a proper background. But I mean, for Christian, I think to read some basic history, I'm afraid I didn't bring a book stall. If I did, I would have brought something like James Hannam, who wrote a book about medieval science. And he wrote talking about this period people thought was the Dark Ages, where nothing happened. Actually, science was flourishing. It was really taking off. And that was fed by the church. These ideas of Galileo being, tortured and condemned, that was largely a political thing. He insulted the Pope, who used to be his friend and then was no longer. So, and the Reformation was on, and all these people were leaving the Catholic Church and starting the Protestant Church, and all these great cultural waves happening. And, now, unfortunately, there are two books written. I think one was the history of the warfare of science and religion, or something like that. There are a couple of books that are very influential, quite fabricated history. Right. The guy called Colin Russell, who is a Christian, who was in the Open University, I remember he got one student, he said, to investigate the idea that Christians opposed the use of anesthetic during child labour because it took away the curse of the fall. And so he got a student to look up, where that rumour came from, and it was invented in this book. So I think people have used the history of science in ideological ways. I mean, you use history in ideological ways all the time.
Yeah.
And you've got to go through with your eyes open and be discerning. And I think there's so much to be encouraged about if you look at Christians who are scientists. I mean, I think that's the place to go to be informed about the culture, is to hear their stories. I mean, there's one book there, and there are many other books that will tell this kind of stories that you can then,
Great,
be
thank
really
you.
encouraged by.
Anybody else want to come back on this notion? Maybe interactions you've had with friends or family or colleagues to do with issues of science and faith and knowledge and what we can know and can't know and so on. Yeah.
Good. I was just about to ask if you're a mathematician. Is that right? Mathematician. Yes.
Can I introduce myself?
Please do. Yes.
Okay, so I studied mathematics originally, and but I've now moved more and more applied, and I now work in an engineering department. I'm at Imperial College, and I'm a senior lecturer there. And I was just going to say in response to that I think if you talk to actual practicing scientists, they realise they don't really understand that much actually, or we've got more questions than answers, and every time you do a good piece of research, actually it throws out a whole load of other questions, and so actually they're often, well, in my experience, mostly they're quite humble about these kinds of questions actually.
Yeah, it's very reassuring, because sometimes you hear these very loud characters proclaiming things, but they're not representative of science. Yeah, not at all.
Thank you, that's helpful. Anyone else on beauty or wonder? Yes. Then we can have a few minutes where we can quiz Ruth on some more general issues. Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned that science isn't your proof of faith, and so sort of thinking about kind of, you alluded to the fact that those are based on more personal other factors. Where the two cross over, if you're able to, just be really interested in probably in a real challenge you faced in your work and with your faith, and a real highlight.
Yeah. I think one challenge was when, just after I finished my PhD, I was offered a project in the same lab, and I realised that some of the techniques I didn't want to do was using embryos from abortions. And, the abortions had already happened, but, I thought, actually, although I'm not completely sure how you'd find that thing out apart from this experiment, I don't want to do it. And, it's a difficult thing to talk about because it's very personal. And also very sensitive, and I didn't know how to talk to my supervisor about it. Eventually screwed up my courage and realised that she just said, it's fine, I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to do. There's plenty to do in the lab, just get on with something else, and I thought, oh, okay, fuss about it. Almost a big fuss about nothing, but, and she was, she had a Jewish background, she's not practicing, as far as I know, but she valued my beliefs and respected them. She herself gave a lot of time to ethical discussion and ethical panels and things, and I should have realised that she was never going to make a big fuss about it. She was just going to be happy. So that was and that was the only time in, from undergrad through to professional, about 10 years that I ever had a challenge. My friend in English department, on the other hand, had loads of challenges because people were very free with their opinions and terrible chauvinist Christians, and all this kind of stuff. And every day, pretty much, she had challenges. I think it's very different. In that way, I think science kind of is value-free, because it's a plant, this is the structure of the plant, and it's actually a lot easier to study, to be in that kind of field. A real highlight. I think just the wonderful things that I've seen. And actually having the opportunity to get a kind of measure of, I think what Jennifer was talking about in engineering maths, saying that how hard it is to find things out kind of helped me to appreciate how amazing the universe is. I remember thinking at the beginning of my PhD, when I find this out, I'm going to do that. Getting to the end and thinking, there's no way on earth you're ever going to figure that out. And that kind of, like the DNA thing, kind of just expanded my horizons immensely, I think. It's a painful, humbling process as you realise you can work for 6 months and find out absolutely nothing. As Simon Conway Morris said in the video, it's largely a life of disappointment. But, the upside is getting this vast view of the world. The vast view of the little tiny corner of the world that you study. I think it's probably a highlight. Nobody's ever asked me that before. Think of a better answer next time.
I was a history student, so let's go for a different angle.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Christians in different disciplines will face different difficulties and opportunities and challenges and so on. So, being a disciple in these different disciplines is crucial. Yeah. We've got a few minutes left. If anyone's got anything general they'd like to ask Ruth about. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. I was really interested, you talked about kind of using a scientific approach in terms of kind of doing spiritual experiments, and I've read about that before, and I like it as an idea, as kind of that it's not that you can have so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've been blessed or cursed with a kind of step-by-step, maybe a very simple way of thinking about things. I remember when I was struggling a bit with my faith, the thing that I found most helpful was a book by a guy called J.W. Sire. I can't remember what his actual name is, but he'd written a few books with IVP, and one of them was Discipleship of the Mind, I think, and he had a picture. It was pretty much a feedback loop, and it said you take a step of faith, something happens, it feeds your faith. Take a step of faith, something happens, feed your faith. And I thought, yes, that's why I'm a Christian. And when I read another book, another American IVP book called Professors Who Believe, I think it's green. I remember there were 2 or 3 people in there who actually did Christianity as a kind of an experiment, but they did it in a good way, I think. Not like when the devil said to Jesus, "Show me your God," he was like, "No, I don't operate that way." But when someone said, "Gosh, I really think God might exist, and I'm going to give it a go," and started joining in with worship services and just testing out little bit by little bit, joining in with an active worship. And that was someone who was open to things outside of the scientific realm. They were open to experiences. I use relationship analogies all the time when I'm talking about Christianity, because that's somewhere where people can understand a non-rational process that is very important to being a part of a human being. And that person who's just joined in with church became a Christian because they realised. And someone else who is kind of funny, she just started behaving what she thought was Christianly and giving someone her seat on the bus or whatever, and realising that this was a positive way of behaving, and you kind of look more and more. And lots of people who were helped by C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, which when I have asked a few friends who are Christians said, because he's so logically deductive about, it's kind of logic, it's more of a legal case in a way than a scientific case for God. I know some scientists who said, it's amazing, it's the best book. That really had an influence on my faith. Loads of people who became Christians. But I think, I think it's that kind of being open to it and giving it a go, which, thinking it was an experiment, it's just another way of describing it, I guess. But do you want to add anything to that, or not really? Yes.
No. No, maybe. I just like it. I think. I teach physics, and I think that I think it's just very important for people to realise that it's not this dichotomy of I just believe because I believe. I just think everything's so beautiful. That kind of it comes across very naive, and I think that it's absolutely that God has given us a brain and wants us to use it, and that I think we understand in the same way that we can approach God in that kind of wanting to understand and explore and question, and we use our, and I guess the natural world explains God in that way, kind of. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like being open to mixing the logical and rational with a wider view of what evidence is, and thinking of it as a relationship rather than prove God exists. That's, I think it's important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Final question down here.
Ruth, as you look at the frontiers of science and think about what the challenges to Christians, to Christian faith, to discipleship, where are the frontiers of science which you think might be most challenging to us as we look ahead into the future?
I think challenges are opportunities. I think might think of it in terms of opportunities. That I think neuroscience is amazing. Really fascinating, and we have someone doing research on that in the Faraday Institute, looking at people who are struggling with different brain diseases and how that affects their spirituality. Even as simple as knowing that our brain, when we pray, something happens in our brain. We are a whole person. It's not disembodied out over there, so that I need to be, it would help if I was well, and had enough sleep and maybe some exercise and rest, and then I will probably find that my prayer life is easier. And if I get sick and I feel far from God, that's, it's kind of, it's not surprising, and it's kind of, it's okay, because you've not suddenly become a horrible person. You've just, prayer is hard work, and it uses your brain. And if you're a bit off peak, it's harder. You have to let God talk to you, and minister to you, and let other people minister to you and pray for you, as well as making that effort yourself, because it's going to be harder. Just people understanding how their bodies work. I'm saying this because it was a neurologist I interviewed in that book, said he's a neurologist and he's a vicar. Very unusual. He's now a hospital chaplain as well as being a consultant neurologist. And he said with those two hats on at the same time, it's quite something, meeting with parishioners and things, and he can kind of apply both those areas of expertise. But then there's loads of other questions about the soul and, the activity of our brain and our emotions and different influences, and our spirituality and different ways of discovering God. And I hope that would be, I guess it will be a challenge as people address the question of what the soul is. And at the moment, that's not really a problem unless you're a neurologist and you're faced with it every day. You can kind of sweep it under the carpet for now. But, it will be a challenge, but hopefully it'll be tremendously releasing for people, and the potential for a really exciting discovery. That people can find out more about how God made us. I think that's certainly when you have science and faith conferences, it's always the neuroscience stuff that's the most cutting edge.
Great. Ruth, we're going to let you stop because we've
thanks.
almost run out. But I want to say thank you, huge thank you for coming tonight and for making everything so brilliantly accessible to us. I found it, as you used the phrase, horizons expanded earlier, and I've certainly felt that for myself, and
thank you for your questions.
Hope others have as well. So thank you folks for your questions, and hope those of you who've been watching online, hope you've managed to feel part of the evening as well. So let's show our appreciation once again, please, for Ruth.